Well, hello, friends. I'm very happy to be able to join you for this conference on interpretations in Indian classical texts in the 20th and 21st century. It's a wonderful opportunity for us to get together and consider these things, and I certainly am very thankful to Dr. Radha Raghunathan for initiating this event. I'm only sorry that I'm not able to be there in person. So for now, this Zoom will have to do. In thinking about the subject matter, I wanted to just weigh in with a perspective on particular literature from the Indian subcontinent. And probably it's no great secret that on a global scale, there is one text that stands out above and beyond all others in terms of its universal recognition globally. And that, of course, is the Bhagavad Gita. It's something that has, over its time, been translated into 75 languages, non-Indian languages. So you add in the English, Indian languages, and you're closer to 100 languages. It's something that has been studied and its appreciation has grown over its lifetime. When we talk about its lifetime, we're talking about quite an extent of time. Although some people would assert that the Gita predates the Mahabharata, in which we are most familiar with it. That's where it has appeared. Dating it in terms of the writing of the Mahabharata, it tends to be somewhere in the neighborhood of around 2,500 years ago that it was written. And it has been a part of Indian spirituality during that time. For those of us who are born in Western countries, we have been exposed to it for a much shorter period of time. In fact, the first European language into which it was translated was English, but that didn't occur until 1785. So, less than 250 years ago. A British gentleman by the name of Sir Charles Wilkins did that translation, and then it entered into the English language for its consideration. Although it was something that was really more, it didn't reach popular awareness at all in any of the English-speaking countries, but in France, apparently, it was something that was prized, and they started departments of Indology as well as in Germany. But for our time together today, I think I would like to focus on the Bhagavad Gita and its awareness of it as a major spiritual text in the world traditions, specifically within the United States, and its history and its growth there. I would like, during the brief time that I will be speaking, to maybe show you some slides, some pictures of some of the people who were instrumental in rooting and growing an awareness of the Gita and its wonderful teachings. I mean, as we know, the Gita is a story of a conversation that takes place between two people, but not ordinary people in any regard. It's a conversation between Arjuna, who is the warrior who is on the verge of having to engage in a battle between himself and his relatives and his teachers and his families, and Krishna. And the conversation, as it turns out, is a conversation not just between two people, but we could even think of it as between two principles. The principle of the highest divine nature, which is also present in the human nature, and the conversation takes place between the highest and between the mind of the human being, but not just the ordinary mind, but the mind that is prepared for to be able to have this conversation. So it's a conversation between Atma and Manas, between the highest and the mind aspect. It's the conversation between Arjuna, and between Krishna. So if I could, let me just show you a few slides and we can talk about it, about some of the people who were instrumental in making this, in rooting this consciousness in the Western psyche, but particularly within the context of the United States. So here's a photo of a young man of Indian descent. It's a photo taken around the time that this gentleman was 19 years old. He's someone who was extremely influential in terms of the promotion globally of an awareness of the value and depth of the Bhagavad Gita. Perhaps you don't recognize him from this photo, but this one might make you much more aware of who we're talking about, because this is none other than Mahatma Gandhi himself. At 19 years old, he traveled to London to pursue his career as a lawyer. And in London, he encountered, he was there only for 3 years, but in London, he encountered a number of difficulties. The climate was challenging. The food was especially challenging because he was a vegetarian and he had been raised in that way. And British food at that time was certainly not famous for its seasonings, or it was famous to Gandhi for its blandness. So that was something that he had to deal with while he was there. But additionally, while he was there, he was actually able to make the acquaintance of certain people. And he writes about it in his autobiography, about my experiments with truth. And what he says in that book speaks about an encounter that became very important to him at the time that he was in London, but also for the remainder of his life, because it was the encounter that introduced him to the Bhagavad Gita. The way he describes it is this. He said, toward the end of my second year in India, I came across 2 theosophists. They talked to me about the Gita. I should say those 2 theosophists, he says they were brothers, but they were actually a nephew and an uncle who were just separated by 1 year in age. But he met these 2 members of the Theosophical Society in England, and he said they talked to me about the Gita. They were reading Sir Edwin Arnold's translation, which was a poetic version called the Song Celestial. And they invited me to read the original with them. So his comment that is quite striking is, I felt ashamed, as I had read the divine poem neither in Sanskrit nor in Gujarati. I was constrained to tell them that I had not read the Gita, but that I would gladly read it with them, and that though my knowledge of Sanskrit was meager, still I hoped to be able to understand the original to the extent of telling where the translation failed to bring out its meaning. So I began reading the Gita with them. So it was the first time, his first exposure to the Bhagavad Gita came through them. And of course, in his later life, he would go on. That was the book that accompanied him everywhere. It was the teachings of the Gita that he leaned on in his darkest moments. So it was something that took root there and then went through the rest of his life. He talks about Sir Edwin Arnold's version, the Song Celestial. Edwin Arnold was also a member of the Theosophical Society, and he had written a poetic rendering, a rhyming rendering of the Bhagavad Gita. Gandhi's comments and this Experiments with Truth, his autobiography, was written much later in his life, but he said, I have read almost all of the English translations of the Gita. and I regard Sir Edwin Arnold's as the best. He has been faithful to the text, and yet it does not read like a translation. So, Sir Edwin Arnold and his version of the Gita is what first introduced Gandhi to what became a lifelong guiding light in his work and in his life, in everything that he did. But Gandhi was not a citizen of the United States. And of course, the Gita's influence began in the United States. Its exposure to the United States began much earlier. Ralph Waldo Emerson, he died just before the turn of the 20th century. He lived from 1803 to 1882. He was the primary moving force in the transcendentalist movement, exceedingly influential in terms of American thought and spirituality at the time that he was alive. He was first exposed to the Bhagavad Gita in 1845. And when he read it, he was exalted and went on himself to write poems based on his readings and interpretations, not only of the Gita, but of other Indian texts. But they were texts that were largely unavailable in the United States. So he was exposed to a copy of the Gita. He said it was very difficult for him to return it to the person that had lent it to him, but he was able to get a copy of his own by sending away to England, and he got the original Charles Wilkins translations. But his comment on his exposure to the Gita was that he said that in all nations there are minds which incline to dwell in the conception of the fundamental unity. This fundamental unity was what he was really took away from the meaning and the presence of Krishna. He goes on to say the raptures of prayer and ecstasy of devotion lose all being in one being. And then he says, this tendency, which he identifies as a tendency of humanity when it functions at its highest, but this tendency finds its highest expression in the religious writings of the East, and chiefly in the Indian scriptures, in the Vedas, the Bhagavad Gita, and he says the Vishnu Purana. So this was his exposure and his thinking about the meaning and the importance of the Bhagavad Gita. Of course, he was something of a lone voice in the United States at that time because no one really was exposed to it. Although at that time, his neighbor and someone who actually lived within his household for a number of years was, at that time, the young man, Henry David Thoreau. Although he was 14 years the junior of Emerson, he died 20 years before Emerson did. Emerson lived 20 years beyond him. But he actually lived in Emerson's household during his early 20s and went on to become his neighbor at the neighboring property for another 20 plus years. But he was absorbed with the Indian literature that he found in Emerson's study. So his comment about his exposure to the Gita, he went on to write on Walden Pond, civil disobedience. He was a huge thinker in the history of American advanced thought and spirituality. His impression of the Gita, he said, the reader is nowhere raised into and sustained in a higher or rarer region of thought than in the Bhagavad Gita. Again, he was overcome by it. And he went on to try and expose others who came within the sphere of his influence to the Gita and its value and its teachings. In fact, there was a young English scholar who visited with them, and Thoreau was able to expose him to it. He went back to England, and as a gesture of thanks, he sent back to Thoreau a crate of books, 44 books in number of, they called them Oriental books, but basically literature, Indian classical literature, which included the Gita and the Upanishads. So this gift collection of Thoreau's became one of the first Oriental libraries in America. So these are two of the real founding influences in terms of the Gita, and a slowly growing awareness of its meaning and its deep value. For many years, following this initial exposure, the awareness of the Gita grew primarily through its appeal to enlightened scholars. So it was within the walls of academia that it took some root and grew, although these enlightened scholars were few in number within the United States. But that was something that would change. And there are some factors that really changed things almost exponentially within the US. But we wind ahead a little bit now to 1944. 1944, two people came together. One, a Swami from India, Swami Prabhavananda. He was a disciple of Ramakrishna, not directly. He was the direct disciple of Ramakrishna's, one that he named as his spiritual son, who took on the Ramakrishna movement following the death of Ramakrishna himself. So Swami Prabhavananda, he was the moving force in terms of the translation. He was a deep student of the Gita and felt, like many, that it was not just a philosophical book, but also a practical one, and one for which the world, there was a great need. Particularly when you think that 1944, the world was at war. And so he combined to write it. I mean, his knowledge of the scriptures and his knowledge of the background of the Gita was extensive. He had emigrated to the United States and went on to found Vedanta Center in California, which became the largest Vedanta group in the United States. But he connected with a gentleman by the name of Christopher Isherwood, who's shown in the foreground of this photo. And they did an issue. Isherwood tried to put the translation into more contemporary English for the audience that he anticipated. And they worked together on this for some time. Also involved in this project, someone who was doing some of the proofreading and also some of the critiquing, was Aldous Huxley, the author of the perennial philosophy and very, very noted participant in matters within the theosophical world as well. And they having written it out, they didn't feel it was completely right. They brought it to Huxley for his critique during the course of the writing of the book. And having read it and thought about it, his comment to them, which they acted upon, he told them, no, that is not right yet. He said, forget that Krishna is speaking to the Hindus in Sanskrit. Forget that this is a translation. He told them, think that Krishna is speaking to an American audience in English. Isherwood took that advice to heart, and the edition that they published went on to sell more than 1 million copies. And you see some of the publications that came out of that same book. It went on to become the standard university text in university classes related to Indology or Eastern religion. Right around this time, you were starting to have some great thinkers who were turning their attention toward matters, the literature that has been produced in India. Arnold Toynbee, the great English historian, he was probably the most read historian of his time, of the 20th century. He made the comment, and this was a quote that came in later years, 1969. His comment was, "Today, we are still living in this transitional chapter of the world history. But it is already becoming clear that a chapter which had a Western beginning will have to have an Indian ending, if it is not to end in the self-destruction of the human race." That was how profoundly he was impacted by what he was aware of in terms of the thought culture and the philosophy and the practical application of that philosophy that was at the root of Indian classical literature. Moving ahead a little bit, actually right in the same time frame that Swami Prabhavananda and Isherwood's publication, there was a great thinker in a completely different field, theoretical physicist, whose unintended association and promotion of the thought of the Gita had and is having a major effect on turning people's attention to that great text. The gentleman's name was Robert Oppenheimer. Again, he was a theoretical physicist who headed up the Manhattan Project, which was the project during the course of World War II, where there was this effort to develop the atomic bomb. He's called the father of the atomic bomb. The United States was in the position of having entered into the war, and even before the war began, the President of the United States was aware of the possibility of the use of atomic power as a weapon. The Germans had already started on it ahead of the US, so it was a high priority to move this thing forward. One of the Oppenheimer was an absolutely brilliant theoretical physicist. He was nominated for the Nobel Prize, I think, on 4 occasions, maybe 3 or 4 occasions. He didn't receive it during his lifetime at all. But he was nominated because in terms of his pushing of the advancements in theoretical physics, he was remarkable. One other feature of Oppenheimer's was that in addition to his advanced thinking and ease of thought within the realm of theoretical physics, he was also quite a linguist. And in his late 20s, when he went to have a professorship at the University of California in Berkeley, he took up the study of Sanskrit. And as a result of that study, he was able to read the Bhagavad Gita in its original form. And so that was something that, to him, it made a huge impression on his thought. It was something that translated into everything that he did. He was really, the teaching of the Bhagavad Gita impressed him on many levels. And it was rather ironic in a sense that here was a man, basically, he was a man who was not in favor of war. He was very much a person who had leanings toward social welfare and non-harm to others. But here in the midst of a war, and again, a war much like what Arjuna was faced with, a righteous war, here he was called on to step beyond his scientific milieu and try to develop a weapon of mass destruction in order to, with the aim of halting a war. But it was one of those really strange situations where this Bhagavad Gita, which in his estimation, he said it was one of the 10 greatest pieces of literature in human history, as far as he knew. And here he, with this as his basis, was called upon to produce this massively, what he knew would be a massively destructive weapon. And he viewed it in terms of the same terms that Krishna defined the battle for Arjuna. The idea that there is the question of dharma. And it was the dharma of Arjuna the warrior to fight the war. Oppenheimer viewed this as a dharmic, something that was his dharma to produce this in the midst of this war, this righteous war. He was very much a proponent of this whole dharma idea. In fact, when he was heading up the Manhattan Project, he was approached by someone within the intelligence agencies of the United States who felt that there might be people who were possibly people who he was working with, other scientists who might be leaking some of the information. And they asked him to, if he could inform them about who and what that might be. He didn't have any knowledge of it, but the person told him that, this is something that you have to do. He responded to the person that it is your dharma to investigate. My dharma is to protect those who are engaged in this effort together. So this dharmic aspect of the Bhagavad Gita had taken a deep root in him. He's a man that's famous for a number of quotes. One of them, he said, it's a humorous nature, but it was also his genuine opinion. He said, talking about people who were the optimists in life, he said, the optimist feels we are living in the best of times. The pessimist fears that this is true. But when the atom bomb actually exploded, they had done the experimentation, it was set to be tested, and then it turned out to be successful. This whole, they called it the Trinity Project. So the Trinity Project, it successfully exploded. He recalled that at the time when he witnessed this, the flash, the mushroom cloud that bloomed up into the sky, that the first thoughts that came to him were actually 2 verses from the Bhagavad Gita. At this moment, he said at that moment, he and the people around him recognized that the world will never be the same again. It was a turning point, an inflection point for humanity. But the two things that came to him at this most impressive, most important inflection point in human history were two verses from chapter 11 of the Bhagavad Gita. And that's the chapter where Krishna reveals his true form to Arjuna. And one of the quotes from that is, if the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the mighty one. That was the first thought that came to him. The first quote from the Gita at that all-important moment. The second one that has become more recognized as a quote that he remembered is, now, this is Krishna speaking about this form that he has revealed to Arjuna. Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. So he is widely quoted for his association, for those moments, the quotes that came to his mind at this moment when the atom bomb first exploded. Probably right now, those same quotes are going to lift the sails of Bhagavad Gita around the world, because his life has just come out as a Hollywood blockbuster movie. So in it, I'm sure that I haven't seen it, but in it, I'm sure there will be, these quotes will have some prominence. So anyway, that's the movement up to the 20th century. In the latter part of the 20th century, I was actually around to witness some of these things. And probably, having had the preparation, the soil being prepared, the intellectual soil first, and then the spiritual soil being prepared first for the acceptance or first awareness that such a thing as the Bhagavad Gita existed, and then the acceptance and recognition of its profound nature. That had happened in a few quarters, but that was about to change. In 1965, at the age of 70 years old, a man came to New York City from India. His name was A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, later known mainly just as Srila Prabhupada. He arrived in New York with virtually no money, but he came on a mission to familiarize the West, beginning with the United States, with the Gita and with Bhakti Yoga practice, as well as other Indian classical literature. He was a deep student. He had, and in fact, he had done many translations already when he was in India. He ran the magazine Back to Godhead within his movement of the Vaishnava movement. But when he arrived in the United States, unlike many of the gurus which were streaming into the US at that time, he elected not to preach to the elite. Actually, he focused on youth and on those who at that time were in the burgeoning hippie movement. And when he arrived, he started off by going to the Tompkins Square, downtown New York, and just started to chant Hare Krishna. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Hare Hare, Rama Rama. And he attracted youth to him. And then he started to teach about the basis for this mantra and the basis for this practice. In many ways, timing is everything. He arrived at a time in the United States, a time of ferment. In the US, there was a large population of disaffected youth. It was in the midst of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, also called the peace movement. It was a time where there was a great deal of experimentation with psychedelic drugs. It was a time where the beginning of this cohort that would identify it as spiritual but not religious, a moving away from the previous forms of that were accepted as the norm of religion in the US. There was an opening to something different. And then he came. And youth, many, many youth were attracted to him. Now, as it happens, I was living in New York City. I was growing up there at the time that he arrived. And, you know, his attraction of these young people who started to appear around the city, it was an unusual sight. It provoked a lot of curiosity. Actually, the people who were affiliated with his movement came to be known as the Harikrishnas. And, you know, a lot of them resembled me in some ways, in that they were young people with a view and who were looking for something different. And many of them just committed to this approach to inner peace and to the ways of sharing it. So you would go through the city and, you know, on corners, you know, street corners around the city, the Hare Krishnas would gather and they would chant and they would dance, the kirtan, they would dance and they would be chanting the chant over and over again in airports around the country, and then soon around the world. They started to appear. In addition to their chanting, they would talk with people. And they would talk with people about the background of their study, what it is that they found important in it. And they would also share. Then the main thing that they would share would be the writings of Srila Prabhupada. And among those, first and foremost among them, was his writing, his translation of the Bhagavad Gita. He called it the Bhagavad Gita as it is. So in its true form is the way that he presented it, his take on his presentation. And it was the words of the Gita, but he also included his purport, so his commentary on the meaning, which made it a very large book, also included many pictures about Krishna and the chariot, Krishna teaching various things. But they would give copies of this. I still, to this day, have a hardbound copy of the Bhagavad Gita as it is. They would distribute these. And so for me, living in the United States, you know, with all of the background of Oppenheimer, Thoreau, you know, Christopher Isherwood, all of the people that had come before, this was my first exposure. And the first exposure of the vast majority of people at that time to the Bhagavad Gita. It was a book that was printed by Macmillan Press in the United States, a notable press, and it was extremely successful. They went on to reprint it and reprint it in an unabridged form, which added another 400 pages to it. So it was something that was quite popular. Since 1965, the estimate is that more than 500 million, not a million, 500 million copies of the Bhagavad Gita are in print since that time. Not of Swami Prabhupada's version, certainly, but worldwide. the growth in interest has been that extreme. One of the things that moved the Western world specifically to give such attention was that it started to move beyond the bounds of just young people and hippies who were associated with the movement, and started to reach into some real celebrity territory. One of which was the gentleman sitting in the middle, George Harrison of the Beatles. It was something where he had begun to turn his attention and the attention of the Beatles as a whole toward Indian spirituality. In fact, the first song that was published of his writing was the song in which he includes the mantra Harikrishna. He calls it "My Sweet Lord." And that was something that was a global success and a global eye-opener. So that was something that promoted the popularity of this book in the American psyche. So, of course, throughout all of this, the Theosophical Society and members of the Theosophical Society were deeply involved in the promotion of a deepening understanding of the value of this Gita. H.P. Blavatsky, Subaru, and others within the Theosophical movement, specifically Annie Besant, because Annie Besant produced a translation of the Gita. In hers, it emphasized the interaction of the human principles, particularly Atma, Buddhi, and Manas. So the highest oneself, the intuitive insight and connection with that highest self, and then its communication to the higher reaches of the mind was what was stressed as the conversation and the dialogue that was taking place. To Annie Besant, the book was a practical guide involved in linking the human vehicles with the highest, with the quote from the Gita, with the inner ruler immortal present in the heart of all beings. So to these many people who came before, I, as an American student of the Bhagavad Gita, owe everything. And so it's something that I thought it would be really worthwhile for us to consider together and view it from the perspective of its growth in America. So I thank you for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to be able to say a little bit of something about these very important and very meaningful development that has taken place over this last 100 years or so in the United States.